Hello world! If you venture deep into the Ableton Manual or forums, you may come across things like
floating point numbers are useful because they allow you to fearlessly mix, amplify, and process tracks without clipping.
Is it true that Ableton works at 32-bit floating point? Does that allow me to
crank up the headroom?
Ableton is not the same rules as in analog due to 32-bit floating point math or whatever. It just works.
But what exactly does all this mean? And more importantly, what does it mean for you as a music producer? Let's find out. Let's start with some knowledge bomb time. When music is stored digitally, it has to be broken down into small chunks or bits, which determine how loud the signal is at each point in the song. If we only have a few bits to represent each chunk, then there are only a few different values that signal can be assigned. Here, we see what's supposed to be a sine wave look more like a pyramid because we're only using a few bits to make it. As we increase the number of bits, the signal begins to look and sound more like a pure sine wave. A 24-bit WAV file, for example, will split this interval up into 16 million steps. Now what's important here is that the maximum value of 0 dB is fixed. For example, even though the bit depth of an MP3 file is less than a WAV file, it's the number of steps in between that increases, not the headroom itself. The amount of volume a signal has left before it reaches this limit we call headroom. So what happens when we try to push the signal beyond the 0 dB limit? Well, there aren't any bits left to represent the signal past this level. All the bits have saturated to their maximum value, so it just stays at this maximum level. We call this hard clipping. Now, by using floating point processing, Ableton can adapt over what range these steps are used. And because it uses 32 bits for this, it has an extra 4 billion steps to play with over the standard 24 bits that we traditionally consider for professional level audio. So Ableton can push the audio way past 0 dB without any reduction in quality. The actual limit is now no longer a hard fixed limit at 0 dB, and the exact value depends on the input signal, but for all intents and purposes, the limit is way higher than you ever need to worry about. So let's put it to the test. Here I have an instance of Serum producing a nice clean sine wave. We can see how pure it is by observing just a single tone in the spectrum analyzer. If we were to hard clip the signal, as can be demonstrated using the saturator, we would start to see and hear harmonics appearing. Now let's use a utility to push the signal past 0 dB, even 30 dB past 0, into the red zone. Regardless, the sine wave comes out as clean as a whistle. Notice I've put a utility at the end of the chain to bring the level back down to 0. But why would I do this? Well, here's why. But wait, we just established that Ableton doesn't clip. Well, yes, inside the DAW, but the audio has to leave Ableton eventually. It routes out from this track, into the master track, and then out. Once it leaves Ableton, it's no longer in the land of bountiful headroom. The important lesson here is that, while we can go about overloading tracks within the DAW, by the time the audio reaches the end of the master, it must be brought back below the 0 dB limit if you wish to avoid clipping. To finish, there's one last very important point to consider, which is that the behavior of many plugins change depending on the level of the signal going into them. So while Ableton won't be clipping off your redlining signals, be conscious of how each plugin in your chain is reacting to the level of the signal. In particular, many analog-modeled plugins intentionally behave differently depending on the level of the incoming signal. Some plugins, such as the Waves CLA series, even have an optimum zone of operation where they recommend you set the level to. In the case of this plugin, it's when the light glows orange. This process of making sure that the signal level going into each stage of your chain is set to the correct level is called gain staging. Click.